I'd like to introduce our second presenter for Food Talk this afternoon. It's Dr. Mike Hamm. He's the CS Mott Professor of Sustainable Agriculture, and he's also the interim chair of the Department of Community Sustainability at MSU, and he's also senior fellow within the Center for Regional Food Systems. And I have Mike Hamm come up and start. Thank you.
Okay. So we're going to do a fast little tour around the world and talk about city regions and food security. So starting point, let's think about what we're talking about. Urbanization, for most of us here in the United States, urbanization is a foregone conclusion. But what we see is that in 2014, there's about 1,690 cities with over 300,000 people. By 2030, we're going to see that grow to 2,225 cities, an extra 700 or 800 cities that are going to have over 300,000 people. And if you look between those two periods of time, what you see is that every city, the number of cities of different sizes grows. So more cities over 10 million, more cities over 5 million, more cities from 3 to 5 million, et cetera. In other words, a much larger percentage of the global population is going to reside in urban areas. This presents a lot of challenges, especially with all of the other issues that we have of climate change and water stress, et cetera, et cetera. This is a daunting task to think about food security for this urbanizing population. And it actually depends on a number of different development events globally. Development around dietary patterns. So if the world eats like the United States eats as it develops, we're in a deep load of trouble. If the US and other countries start to shift their dietary patterns, maybe not so much. Social justice. Right now, we could say there's probably enough calories produced in the world, but the distribution of those is way off kilter. And there's a lot of other stuff we could say about that, but suffice it to say that social justice, women's rights, education for women and young children are key components of ensuring food security in this urbanizing environment. Technological development. There's a whole lot of things when we start thinking about shifting people from rural areas to urban areas and the shift in the ratio of urban to rural people. What it means is that farmers in rural spaces are going to have to be able to produce food for more people, for a greater number of people than they potentially do right now. And what does that mean about technological development, appropriate technological development, so people have control over that technology, and that technology and the companies that develop it don't have control over them. And food waste, where we estimate about 40% of the food in the globally is wasted. Different parts of the supply chain, it's wasted depending on where you are. Reducing that waste could have huge impacts on the amount of food we actually have to produce. And so if we start in a place like Lilongwe, the second largest city of Malawi in East Africa, and we look at where people shop and think about urbanization and think about what this means, I want to call out my colleague Stephanie White, who's here, this is really her work, and she's leading this project. But if you survey consumers, shoppers in the open air markets in and around Lilongwe, what you find is that the vast majority of them shop all the time in markets like the one they were surveyed at. Open air markets with regional supply chains, with mostly small scale traders. Very few say they also shop in supermarkets or even in small shops. And research of David Shirley and his colleagues in Ag Econ project that in East Africa in 2040, 60% of the market economy for food will continue to come in those open air markets. So what does that mean? In a period of urbanization with greater population growth in these urban areas, if we don't think about the farmers that are supplying that food, the supply chain that gets it there, the traders that are doing all that trading, and how we can increase that so that livelihoods are improved, sustainability is increased, and more food's going through those routes, food security has a huge chance of collapsing instead of getting better. If we move to the United States quickly, we have a different kind of challenge, because by and large, we have a food supply where large numbers of people, I'd say the greatest percentage of the population, can buy almost anything they want almost any time of the year. If you're willing to get to the right markets, and you can get to the right markets, you have the money to buy it. That said, one of the things that's probably true, given where a lot of our food comes from, 50% of the produce produced in the United States today comes from California. They're challenged with population growth and the sprawl that entails. They're challenged with water challenges, and that snowpack in the Sierra Madres will probably decrease by about 70%. It'll come down more as water, and that water won't be there in the summertime when it's needed for irrigation. et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The challenge to that means that probably going forward 30, 40 years from now, California is not going to be doing what they're doing now, and we probably won't be able to source as much produce globally, because in those countries where we're currently sourcing especially lots of bananas from, there's going to be lots more people. They're also going to have challenges with climate change and water and food security in their own country. So the whole thing becomes very challenging. And so one of the things that we've argued is that we need more regional, city region food systems. What's the challenge to that? Well, in the United States today, and this is based on the 2012 census, there's at most about 194,000 farms that grow fruits and or vegetables. This is just adding up all the farms under the various fruit and vegetable categories in the 2012 census. If all of our produce came regionally from 1 acre farms in 2020, we'd need 5.6 million of those 1 acre farms. And I don't see a jump from 194,000 to 5.6 million happening. If that were all coming from 10 acre farms, 194 stays constant, we need 560 farms. That's still about a 2.5 to 3-fold increase. And the one below it says if people actually ate the produce that they're supposed to, i.e. about 50% more than we do now, we need 840,000 farms, not 194,000. So what all of that says to me is that to do this, we both, A, have to increase the opportunities for people to move into farming, and I think there's elements of that that are happening. The other thing that we need to do is provide opportunities for people that come into farming new and start very small because they really don't know what they're doing and they're getting their feet wet and they're moving along. But how can they scale up into an acreage size that starts to generate, on the one hand, a really stable livelihood for their families where they can actually afford health care and they don't have to work off the farm for that, and they can afford a 401k and things like that, but do it in a way in which labor doesn't increase linearly. And so that means increasing the mechanization potential, I think, that's part of my argument, for these farmers so that they can scale from 1 acre to 5 acres to 10 acres to 20 acres if they want to. That's a personal choice. So we've got like the student farm, and I know Katie's here from the student farm, that's doing some great partnerships with our Ag Bioresource Engineering Department and our Mechanical Engineering Department to look at how can we create some of that appropriately scaled machinery that doesn't exist, and do it in a way where we can down the road use renewable energy, solar and wind, to drive that. So they're working right now with Ajit and Ag Bioresource Engineering on a solar pump that's also being tested in Burkina Faso. There's a lot of the technology for the small scale production here that could be done with renewable energy has potential in much of the developing world in micro energy grids and stuff to get appropriately scaled equipment where you can use renewable energy to do it. Okay. Yeah, so there's the 840,000. I did have it there. The final thing is, and one that I've been kind of, and ended up getting embroiled in a lot of different discussions about because of one thing that I wrote 2 years ago, is the challenge of where and how. And so the first two parts there is some research from that Rachel Plawecki did when she was an undergraduate with me, looking at getting lettuce from California in the summer versus growing it in an unheated hoop house. And what you can see is the carbon footprint of producing it in Michigan in the hoop house is about 1/5 that of getting it from California because of the transportation. If we now add heat to that and still grow it locally, we now have still a much larger carbon footprint than if we grew it in an unheated hoop house. On the other hand, we can guarantee the production rate. If we now add lights and kind of the new sexy thing that everybody's talking about and the venture capital is going into is indoor vertical farming, the problem with that is that when you take away a free source of energy and add in a costly source of energy that you've got to produce, your carbon footprint goes up dramatically. So my point with this is that while we're thinking about these regional food systems, we also have to do this in a way that maintains and keeps the environmental footprint as low as possible. So I think it's very feasible in a place like Michigan to think about how we could much more regionalize our production, do it in a way which reduces the carbon footprint and reduces the water usage. And so with that, I'll say that there is, usually we say there's opportunity and necessity, but I think that the first thing we have to recognize is that there's necessity. There's necessity both in the global south, and there's necessity in the global north to rethink the way we eat, the way we produce, the way we market, and the way we transport our food. And we need to do that fairly quickly. And in order to do that, so that all these 2,200 city regions around the country that have more than 100,000 population, in fact, can be food secure. With that, I'll close and just say my grandmother, who's now 109 in this picture here on your right, still loves her beer. So the thing we got to make sure that we have is plenty of barley and plenty of hops, because I think she's going to wither some point. She's not going to die. She's just going to keep going. She turns 110 in January. The end. And see, with 12 seconds left, so I get an extra question.
We have two questions. Here's your first one.
All right.
Mike. Repeat the question.
Can you say more about a healthy diet versus an unhealthy diet and climate change? Sure. I can, oops, wait a minute. I can say a lot about that. There's, of course, a tremendous amount of dialogue, research, argument, debate around the world about what is a sustainable diet. And some people contend that a vegan diet is the only diet that's truly sustainable. I actually do not think that. I think it's fine to be a vegan, and I think you can eat well from it. I think that what data that's emerging from Jason Roundtree's research on intensely managed pasture systems and some of the stuff that's coming in from there with the potential for carbon sequestration of ruminants on properly managed land, and some of the other data that's coming in, I actually think in the United States today, and probably globally eventually, the most sustainable diet is going to be one that is very heavily plant-centric and one which has some amounts of meats and dairy products in it, but much less than what we have today. That said, when you think about the food system, it's just not what we put in our mouths. It's also all the transportation costs of moving it. It's the way it's produced when it's in the fields and stuff like that. So I could probably define a plant-centric diet that would be incredibly unsustainable, and probably develop an animal and plant-based diet that would be incredibly sustainable. So the devil's in the details. That's probably enough on that.
We have another. This one's short, and we have possibly one more. This is, I think, a short.
Am I a member of the Union of Concerned Scientists? I do donate to them. So.
Okay. It's a really long question. We'll have to have. Go ahead and read it, and then Mike will repeat it.
Okay. From Monica DeGarmo. Based on your research, where should energies be focused on in terms of developing and recruiting new farmers? Should there be greater focus and training for high school students in urban areas to start small-scale urban farms that can contribute on a small scale to urban areas, or do the economics support regional food systems that larger farms outside of the city?
Well, that's nothing like that's a long question and a loaded question. The answer is simple. The answer is simple, though. Yes. So the answer is I think that both of those should be done, and here's why. So let me take Detroit as an example, or let's take Flint as an example. I know we've got Terry here. Let's take Flint as an example. There is a certain amount of land in urban areas that can be devoted to fruit and vegetable production. Most typically, it's vegetable production, and I think we should encourage young people in urban areas to go into that. That said, I've seen very little argument around providing grains and protein in urban agriculture. There's some, but I think it's going to be fairly limited. So I think we need both. That said, I also think that in most urban areas, there are probably a dozen or two in the United States, urban areas because of out-migration, where there's enough land, if you do the analysis and you want to put the land into that, to generate at least the vegetables for the population of that city. But those are relatively limited. And so I think that what really needs to happen is that to happen, and some of those people maybe then decide, I want to farm at a larger scale and move out of the city and onto a piece of land. And I think we need to encourage people in the rural areas and the peri-urban areas to move into farming in those regions, and think about how we can build supply chains through food hubs and other kinds of things to service those urban areas and the peri-urban areas around them. So the answer is, I think we really do need both. Okay?
Thank you, Mike.